Okay, good morning to you. Welcome to our walk through the book of John here at the Easter time. We are going to be in actually chapter 13 today. I want to ask you one thing before we get started here. Have you ever, as a Christian, and I'm sure you have, had a real distinct impression of God in your life or presence of Jesus in your life? My wife and I walk in the neighborhood every day. But years ago, I used to walk early in the morning time. It was dark and cold at that time of morning. It was in the summertime, close to Easter. And I had walked around the block. It was, like I said, it was dark. I had walked around the block and was just about to go back up the street to my house. And I came by a little thicket of woods right there. And I had been thinking about the morning of Jesus's going to be brought before the Sanhedrin and the religious leaders and everything. But anyway, as I came down this little side street, I had a real over-demanding presence of Jesus on that morning. It was dark, it was cold, and it was still. And I stopped for just a moment at that thicket of woods right there, and I really had a distinct impression of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane at that time, knowing that he would be, his accusers would come to him at a short time. So with that, with the word impression, as we look at chapter 13 this morning, Jesus gives a distinct impression to his disciples in this chapter of 13. But before we get started and read a little bit of that, we're reminded by Luke in chapter 22:15, as Jesus gets ready to have the Passover meal with his disciples. Luke records that Jesus said, "I have eagerly longed and awaited to eat this Passover meal with you before I suffer." So chapter 13, verse 1 says, "It was just before the Passover feast. Jesus knew that the time had come for him to go back to his Father from the earth. As he had loved those who had been with him in the earth, he showed them the extent of his love for them. At this time in the meal, he gets up from the meal. He takes off his outer garment. He puts a towel around his waist, and he gets a basin of water, a pitcher of water, and he pours water into that basin, and he begins to go around to each disciple and wash their feet. And then he goes and backs and sits down. He asks them, 'Do you really understand what I have done for you at this time?' And he says, 'Now that I have washed your feet, you should wash one another's feet. I have set an example for you to remember and to live out the rest of your lives.'" Later on in the chapter, Jesus reveals who his betrayer would be, which we know to be Judas. Later on in the chapter 2, he also reveals to Peter that he would deny him 3 times. But as we move down to the end of the chapter, Jesus gives a commandment to his disciples. One that's an impressionable commandment to them, one that will stay with them for the rest of their lives, one that speaks to us as believers, as Christians every day in our walk. He says, "A new commandment I give you, to love one another as I have loved you. If you do this, all men will know that you are my disciples." As believers, that's what we want to fulfill and live out as God's commandment to us. We want to be acknowledged and recognized as disciples. We want to please God in that, to let him know that we are his disciples and live out his commandment each day. As you know, in this chaotic world that we live in this, I should say, upside down world we live in, or maybe just instead of the world, we know Jesus made the world and God made the world, and it was a beautiful place. But the environment, I guess we could say, that we live in this day and time, we are still compelled and impressioned by God to live out that commandment, to love one another. So as we close, I want us to think about one question. Is a law the same as a commandment? You know, when we obey our laws in society, if we obey our laws, then it keeps civil order in society, doesn't it? But if we obey Jesus' commandment to love one another, it does a couple of things. It gives encouragement. It gives life to the receiver. It also gives life to the giver of that commandment to love one another. But I think most of all, it honors God and it brings glory to God for us to live out that commandment in his life. So tomorrow there'll be another devotion. We thank you for our time, and happy Easter to you today.